Elmarie has asked me to wait for about just 2 minutes, and then we can start. I know that it's time now, but if we can just hold on for 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll start.
Can we breathe?
Yes, you can. The only thing is that we can't bring a glass of wine to you, so you have to do your job first, and then we'll have the glass of wine afterwards.
Understand rewards.
Yes.
Chair, we were introduced to Queen Victoria a little earlier. She said she was Queen Victoria, so is this Prince Albert next to her?
I reject that.
On the hour.
I worked 3 years in a bank, which took me 3 minutes to walk. Every day I was there. Because I was down 2 minutes before.
Have you ever heard this saying,
I'm not keen either. Höflichkeit ist die... Pünktlichkeit ist die Höflichkeit der Königin.
I think we get started. I would like to welcome you all to the STIAS Fellows book launch. And as I mentioned before, this is going to be by 2 of the STIAS fellows. Once a fellow, always a fellow, so I can't say former fellows. Andreas Freytag and Abena Oduro, and would like to welcome Abena. It's good to see you on the screen. It would have been nice to see you here, so you owe me a visit, and I'm looking forward to that. It is also nice to see some of the fellows here, our colleagues that support us. So thank you very much for coming to listen to this afternoon, evening's presentation and launch of the book, and we decided that it's going to be conversational, and hopefully by the end of the conversations, you'll be able to buy all those books out there. So it's a great opportunity to meet the editors for an evening stimulating discussion, networking, and refreshments afterwards. The program we run very briefly. This be Ursula van Wyk will be our moderator. She will introduce Andreas and Abena. They will have a conversation around the book. Then we'll have a short end to it of question and answers. And then most of the other questions will be over a glass of wine and water. So if I may briefly introduce Ursula and leave the rest of the task to you. She holds a Doctor of Philosophy in History and is a professor at the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University. She's the founding director of the Center for Research on Democracy, and so probably the interrogation is going to be from a democratic angle, how democratic Andreas and Abena were in coming up with this book. And she's also, so the center is the Center for Research on Democracy, CREDO, and she's also been a founder, director on previous research units. She works with a global interdisciplinary network of researchers, and she has planned and headed a series of consecutive projects on democracy in South Africa in a continental and global perspective since 1995. Please don't count the years. One of the projects was conducted at STIAS, and I should say that Ursula is one of the very first team project fellows at STIAS. So welcome again. It's always good to see you. And that project was in 2008. And I think, and still don't count the years. And she's a recipient of numerous research grants, and also she's written, published series of books. I think she's on the 6th, she's finished 6 and on the 7th counting. And so we look forward, Ursula, to you introducing the authors of this book and editors, and then having a conversation with both them and ourselves. Ursula, welcome. And they decided that they should sit. They're going to sit and have this very nice conversation. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I actually don't know I'm here, quite frankly, because I'm not an economist. But having said that, I do appreciate having been asked, because the project started actually at one of our workshops of the pre-credo period. And at that time we had quite a lot of our global colleagues around, several from Germany in particular, and the idea, Andreas came up with the idea of doing a research project on the integration of African countries. And it was, at the time, he thought that the European Union might be the model on at which to look at to do this kind of project. And at the time, my team members, who always know best, said that, but it's not going to work. This is not comparable, and there are completely different circumstances, histories, politically, economically. This is not going to work. And I thought, shame, Andreas will say, well, yeah, well, I'll give up then. But he didn't, because he is a dedicated academic who has done a lot of work already, and the main thing is that he had a good idea, and that idea now has been put into action, and we can see in this book the outcome of that action. So that's all I can say at this point. I can't really introduce Andreas beyond saying that he's a wonderful chap and a new grandfather.
Thank you, thank you. Right, thank you very much for your nice words and bringing a bit about the history. And before I comment on that, I would like to express some thanks and then hand over to Abena. First one, when I had the first idea, I exchanged views and perspectives with Estian and Kirche, both in the room, and I want to thank them for their stubbornness to bear with me. Every time I met them, I talked about this project, and we went through this project very often. And then we had this workshop where you also were present, and the thing was turned. Although I have to say, we never believed, we as Peter and I, who have a chapter in it about it, we never believed that the role model, that the EU is a very good role model, but everybody else seemed to believe. And therefore we were so narrowly minded to think that that's enough to do. But it turned out that the broadening of the perspective that was encouraged by the Credo colleagues, as well as in a workshop we had at STIAS in 2020, really paid off. It really paid off. So thank you all who participated then. I also would like to thank Edward and the STIAS team for several instances of great hospitality and intellectual an intellectual space for the mind. What is it? Yeah, space
yes,
for
that's
the
the
mind.
one.
Yeah, and I learned enormously by working. And you also suggested, Christoph, you suggested that I work with Abena, which turned out to be an excellent choice. Thank you very much for that. Finally, one of the conferences we had was financed by MIASA. I would like to mention that at the stage here. Thank you very much. And I also would like to thank Abena for the great cooperation we had. I can say that we didn't know each other before, but I think there was never any doubt that we picked the right papers, and we agreed on leaving out the wrong ones. And when we had a criticism of a paper, we both had the same idea, the same angle. So that was just perfect. Thank you very much. And with this, before I then go to the book itself, I would like to hand over to Abena.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm sorry I cannot be with you today, but I'm as excited as I can say Andreas is that we have finally completed the book. I think it's been a journey of about 5 years when we first started working together. And I would also, like Andreas, want to acknowledge the contribution of Miasa. At the time that we began our work together, I was the director Ghana for Miasa, and I think that also explains how come I became part of the project. So our thanks go to Miasa for funding the conference that we had in Stellenbosch. And again, also thank you to STIAS for the 6 weeks that we spent working on the book together. So I think that's what I would like to say for now.
Okay. What I could do is I could lay out a bit the topic, and here is my first contradiction to the moderator. You are the right person because you're not an economist. We have a lot of economists in the book, but we also have other social scientists, and that is, I think, the great benefit from my perspective. So we have political scientists, we have linguists, we have lawyers, we have an economic historian who added enormous value because they changed my perspective. And I remember one of the referees saying, "Oh, this is a non-economist paper, we shouldn't have that." And I responded then to the publisher, "No, we should have it because it's a non-economist paper, because it's a different perspective." We all and I think that is the great value for the independent reader, so to speak, that you can, particularly in a theoretical part, you get 5 different perspectives on the theory of integration. We economists have a very clear perspective. We look for welfare effects, and integration is welfare enhancing up to a certain degree. There's trade diversion, trade creation. Pretty boring if you read this another time. So I encourage the economist in the theoretical section to think more about club theory and take a different perspective on that as well. But everyone, of course, cited Balassa, the economist who was the first to deal with economic integration. So that is the second part. The first part is the introduction, which Abena and I have done. That's the second part. In a third part, we look at African experiences. And these are mostly economists who deal with it, mostly. So we look at trade effects, we look at the institutional challenges to this integration endeavor in Africa. You know that the AFCFTA is the largest free trade area in the world, but still there's a lot of skepticism, which you can see also mirrored in the fact that it is the first time that the book deals with the AFCFTAs in the last part. Again, Abena and myself, we try to draw some lessons for the AFCFTA, but most of the authors deal with individual regional economic communities, the RECs, instead of looking at the AFCFTA. So the trust of the African authors in this new free trade agreement is limited, I have the impression. And we learned while reading the experiences why it is limited. In the third part, we look at experiences from other continents. And that was a quite difficult encounter. First, because we were so stupid to think we only have to focus on Europe. Second is that when we organized our conference, so we organized a conference. It was held at STIAS in September 2021, I think the first one after Corona here again. And we had a call for papers. And we said what we would like to have, the themes. And we got 110 applications for 15 chapters. There was no single chapter planned on Asia, and one single chapter planned on Latin America, which turned out to be not suitable. the presenter was here, but we decided to not accept that paper. It was too narrow and had a certain ideological twist, which was beyond the normal acceptance of I mean, we also work normatively, so I understand that, but this wasn't really helpful. So we had to ask some friends to join us, and it was quite a difficult undertaking, particularly for Latin America. For Asia, there's a lot of work on Asian integration, so we found 2 good chapters, and we finally found a very good one on Latin America too. So, and we have 3 on Europe, so because Europe is still the main funder, and we looked at from different perspectives on the European experience. And indeed, it turned out that all 3 authors are highly skeptical with respect to the applicability of European institutions and European norms to Africa. And that is, I think, the main lesson of this book. We have to be, those who are then designing in African trade and also trade flows, service trade, capital flows, personal movements. They should be very careful designing this, because it's a different world than the European world. It's also a different world than Latin America and Asia. So one thing we noticed in the course, in Europe we have what we call a hegemon, France and Germany. There's no here in Africa. And there's also so that's one very important difference, I think. So finally, I would say, why would be a European, a German interested in African integration? You might have asked yourself why this happens. And one is, of course, I've always been interested in economic integration, but the other one is, from a German perspective, Africa becomes more and more relevant as a trading partner, although the German government does not seem to accept this fact, but for me it's a fact, and we must invest more intellectual capital into this relation to make it a better relation than in the past, but also to a relation with benefits for both sides. So, and that's what I wanted to say at the beginning, about the content and the motivation of this book.
Well, you just said that Germany, obviously, and other countries have interest in cooperating with African countries, and I think the book has been written. That's strangely enough it's a new book, and yet so much has changed already in the global system. So when you talk about the interest of the United States and China in Africa, that relationship has changed. That interest has changed too, given that Trump is not a great fan of Africa. And I think that leaves open for African countries to actually have a better relationship with European countries, with other partners, and we all have to see how things work with the involvement of China on this continent. From what I have learned is that it is very transactional. It is that's normal. I mean, every country is interested more in what can we get out of it. But nevertheless, we have to take all of these sort of external reconfiguration into account.
That's definitely true. I mean, we implicitly, I think all authors implicitly accepted the rules-based world trading order as the foundation of what we observed in every regional integration area. So we have a surge in regional agreements since the founding of the WTO. Almost 300 now notified and also mostly ratified. The EU is a champion in regional integration, but the Africans have the largest number in one free trade area. And it's all based on this assumption that it is within the framework of the WTO. And this is changing, indeed. And this makes it even more important for both for the Africans to think about their position to rules, because if you, as a small country, and this is a bunch of small countries economically speaking, make yourself dependent on transactional actors like Mr. Trump or like the Chinese government or like the Russian government for that matter, you may find yourself in a dire position at some stage. So this is another incentive, I think, to strengthen trade within Africa,
Absolutely.
investment flows within Africa, and also what the Europeans call the four freedoms, the other two parts of the four freedoms, namely movement of people. We just discussed before this meeting here with Edward that it is embarrassing to travel within Africa, whereas it's quite easy to travel from Europe to Africa, and this must change. And it's for the benefit of the Africans. And what is also important is that if you look at the trade pattern, you see that the African exports to the rest of the world consists mostly still of commodities. Within Africa, there's a different composition of trade, of goods, and more manufacturing products, many of which, by the way, produced by Chinese-owned companies. But still, there is the big chance to increase manufacturing trade within Africa by dismantling trade barriers. Yeah, and also, when I may conclude here, from my perspective, also look for others who are interested in rules-based policy, and then brings us back to Europe, because I think the European Commission is still one of the biggest proponent of the rules-based system at the moment.
Well, from our perspective of studying democracy, you know, we are terribly concerned that the rule-based system is in such a dire straits at the moment. And we, in actual fact, are going to start a project to, I don't know to what extent we can contribute to the conversation, but we must try. But what I liked about one of the approaches, well, I think the major thing that I have taken out of this book is one of the major things, was that you have discarded the idea of doing the integration in stages in favor of categories. And I think that is actually the proper approach, because it allows you, it's not as ambitious. You don't start from a certain level and you expect in 15 years to be at a much higher level. But the categories, especially given the complexity of this continent and so many countries and languages, that chapter about language was fantastic. So I think the approach for integration is much more practical when you look at categories rather than assuming that there will be steps taken from political, economic, and social perspective.
Yes, I think maybe Abena has to add as the African here.
I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty following because of the sound. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
So could you repeat the question, please?
I said that it would be that I found it very encouraging, the pragmatic attitude that you took towards the idea of integration, and have decided to go for categories of integration rather than having stages where you have your assumption is that the stages will be going up and up and up. And the sort of idea of categories in different parts of the continent as the nuclear of greater integration, maybe somewhere in the future, is a much more pragmatic one than assuming from the start that, well, this is the path and we're going to from 1 to 10 within 12 years or something like that.
Yes. Yes, indeed. You are right in saying that it is realistic, because Africa is a continent of 54 countries, all with different interests, different constraints. And so the building up from the official categories that have been recognized by the African Union, and recognizing that different countries having different interests would take a different time to achieve their objectives, I think is a useful one. In that regard, you could also say that as particular groups or countries make progress towards achieving their goals, it sets a good example for the others to aspire to.
Indeed. I would fully agree, because the European bicycle theory doesn't work. So we are assuming that we must move on, and if we don't move, we fall. What I think what Europe could learn from Africa is also that we shouldn't be multilateral within the EU, but plurilateral. So there should be the possibility of coalitions of the willing to proceed, like in the euro. The euro is such an example. It's not fully executed, because once you fulfill the criteria, you must become a member of the European Monetary and Economic Union. But the criteria formulate in a way that Poland, for instance, having low inflation but is not member of EMS2, doesn't fulfill the criteria. And they
Terrible,
don't,
the Poles.
They don't want it. They don't want to. And they may have good reasons for that. So, and this is something which in Europe is sort of hobbling us. So we are bound by that, and we don't think out of the box. And there was one paper, or is one paper, by a political scientist who speaks of heterarchies instead of hierarchies, and sort of multiple membership of countries in REX from a European perspective is almost intolerable, because there are so many rules of origin to be thought of, and what a chaos from an ordinary European perspective. And this colleague says, no, that's our strength. We can deal with that chaos, and we deal very well with it. And that's something that really opened eyes for me, that there is scope for different paths within the same framework, which the European Union denies themselves, I would say.
What I also found very interesting, as I mentioned just now, is the chapter on languages, and the incredible number of languages on this continent, and the idea that there should be several leading languages for certain areas that have that language in common. I think this is perhaps not easy to achieve, but if you do look at categories, the categories could be defined by a group of countries that actually have a common language, because we all know what the colonial legacy is, and that is that the countries, states, have been created from various bits and different tribes. So therefore, such a multitude of languages. And that is not an easy way to, there is no easy way to overcome this, especially if Africa wants to engage and must engage in multilateral exchanges. That brings to the fore other languages, especially English or French, which is in a way tainted on the continent, but that must be, I think, forgotten.
Maybe Abena has an opinion here. So I just want to say the author was more optimistic about the doability in her first version, and we tried to convince her that this is one should be careful here. And I think the outcome is excellent.
Yes.
I'm with you here. Abena.
Yeah, with respect to languages, you could say that it is a challenge, but it is important also that we do develop languages, especially languages that cross borders, because much as we do have a multiplicity of languages on the continent, which is not surprising given that we are 54 countries to begin with, we have lots of languages that do cross borders, and that, building upon what the author said, can be the basis for us to develop languages which you could say would become official. And I think the African Union is recognizing some African languages. So there is a move in that direction for realizing that there is benefit in having indigenous African languages being promoted. And you would find also that for many Africans, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish are not their first languages. So it is important that we develop the traditional languages beyond the stage that they are now.
economist, I'm always skeptical how to do that.
What?
You cannot impose a language to others.
No, it's not going to be easy, but if you have cross-border groups of languages, that is a certain basis for what you have in mind to bring those countries together, even if on a sort of limited level, because these are precisely the categories that you're talking about.
Oh, yes.
So you've got 4 or 5 countries that do have cross-border language connections, which I think could be helpful in starting on the ground level.
Indeed, you're right.
My question is, I think you have mentioned that somewhere, that there is no leading country strong enough that could, for example, the European Union was created primarily due to France and Germany, right?
Yeah.
So are there no countries on this continent that could be the leaders in such a enterprise? That's what I don't quite get.
I mean, when you think about the history of the European Union, it is based on 2 countries that for centuries were in warfare. And so the whole project is a peace-creating project. I'm personally a big fan of the trade creates peace hypothesis. And at least we are a good example for that. And there is no necessity here. Yeah? And of course, so, and if you look at the first 6 countries, it is Italy, France, Germany, I would say on peers, and then it's the Benelux, much smaller as compared, and it was the German and French governments that engaged in the first instance. The question is, of course, whether it is needed. Maybe you can have multiple leadership. One is driving the capital market, could be Johannesburg, and then one is driving the service industry, that could be the East Africa or something like that. I can imagine that, but I can't imagine that now 2 countries send their governments and committees and work together and work out a plan and everybody follows.
Yes, you see that again fits into these categories, approach rather than stages.
Yeah.
In political, economic development together, you know.
Yeah. So that's why we, and it doesn't follow a plan that we say there is no hegemony. It was just worked out during the process.
You came to that conclusion, yes. I see there's a question.
What do you mean by categories?
Well, in this book, you know, after a lot of consideration, it has been, well, you can answer the question better than I do, because I've just read the book in the last few days, you know, and here's the main man.
So Abena has lost us. So when you look at the classical, say, economics literature, Stephen, you know this better than I probably, but you have this preferential area, you have the free trade area, you have the customs union, you have the and at the end you have a political union, United States of Europe. So as a horror scenario, I would think, for most Europeans. And we didn't go that route. We said we didn't even look at that. Is this a preferential area? But we looked at categories like language. Is language a barrier or a driver of integration? We had some legal issues in the sense that we looked at dispute settlement processes in one of in SADC here as one thing. Then there was somebody looking at the institutional barriers like corruption, like economic freedom, and so on. Whether this is a driver or barrier of integration. Then inequality was looked at. Is integration driving inequality, or is it reducing? We would rather like to see it reduces inequality. A bit was discussed. Informal cross-border trade is a big issue, which is not documented well. And these are categories, I would say. And the first chapter on theory started with using club theory to understand the logic of forming an integration area from that perspective. So joint interests, if you wish, as basis. But never with this idea taking stock, where are we in this ladder or in this ranking you just mentioned. Yeah.
What is very important, and it's mentioned in the book, is that we have a tendency on this continent to have a lot of good agreements, but implementation is a problem.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you then again, on a smaller scale, it is probably easier to reach an agreement and actually discuss, all right, we have this agreement on the table now, but how are we going to go about it?
Yeah.
Because, for example, the AU is notorious for this, simply not caring much about what agreements have been taken. You know, I know from one of our authors, for example, how the access to the internet on this continent is being promoted by the AU, and yet it's being barred by so many governments, especially in pre-election times. So there are these issues of getting something in writing, which is good, but the idea here is to actually go the main step forward, and that is to start exchanging the goods, to do integration, even if it is on you know, a lower level than you would have hoped to achieve in the end.
May I ask a question?
Certainly. That's why we're here. We could hear you.
Yes, I thought you could
But-
probably hear me, maybe
Oh.
nobody else can.
Yeah, online.
I have twofold questions. Number one, what were you thinking that the integration, I haven't read the book, unfortunately, tried to read it a bit online, but didn't get that far. What is your considered integration for Africa, number one? What is the overall plan? And number two, have you considered a bioregional approach? More land-based bioregional approach for resources and that sort of thing, because that kind of more speaks to the norms and values of Africans.
What do you mean by regional? What approach?
Bioregional.
Bio.
Bio.
Yes.
Yes, not bio.
Bio.
A bioregion is an area, homologous area that people would consider to be their identity and belonging, and the area that they would be of a geographical and and language and cultural and geology and all that sort of thing. It basically is a level, many-level area that would be homologous in its entirety. So therefore, the region would considerably have certain resources that would be tradable with other bioregions. So that's why I was asking, had you even considered that approach?
Well, it's a good question,
It
because,
is.
yeah, but
I take it as a suggestion for the next project. We haven't. And we also don't have a grand plan. I mean, we looked at what is the, so at least the economists in the room took it as granted that integration is beneficial. So we subscribed to the objective, so to speak, but we didn't have a plan what is a desired outcome. We then looked at theoretical concepts to understand it, and then where are we and what are other continents, what are the lectures, other lessons other continents could provide. And in the final chapter we try to summarize that and draw a few, but very, say, down-to-earth policy conclusions.
So more a capitalist approach?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it is, if you say yes.
But your question is very
That
valid.
would be, but with varieties of capitalism, not a single capitalist approach. There is no single capitalist approach. We have capitalisms everywhere. Some are good, some are not working well, some are not working well. But we have the basis, say, methodologically, we have individuals and they can trade. It's a matter of freedom for them to trade or not to trade. And what they trade should be left to them. And not.
Hold on, I just want to go back to your suggestion or question. I think that the idea of cross-border integration, language-wise, could be extended to bio issues. In other words, common interests that already exist and bring the people together. And that is precisely why I think the approach to do categories, rather than have a big plan, you know, we're going to integrate Africa, it's not going to work.
There is, of course, an acknowledgement of informal trade, and informal trade, I think, is related to what you call a bioregion.
Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
Yes, but I'm more on that side. I developed a model towards sustainable socio-economic development about 15 years ago. I developed a model towards sustainable socio-economic development about 15 years ago. And I work closely with Koi and San, who's actually one of the senior chiefs sitting right here, actually.
Sorry, who are you?
My name is Erika Viesma, Sustainable Life Project. To just keep it very short, because I'm sure I'd like to hear more about what you guys have been doing. But in Africa, or African way, is more horizontal, homologous construction rather than hierarchical. Not everywhere, but that's more construction. So if we are going to go a top-down approach or some sort of hierarchical approach, that's going to die in the first iteration. So one has to be more on a level, and how is it actually working for everybody? That each region, each tribe, each indigenous group, so to speak, with the animals and other inhabitants, and being plants and animal and so forth, all the inhabitants are beings that all are sharing space, and they've been doing so all these centuries. So I think that actually what ought to be looked at is how Africa did it and could do it before there was the imposition of the capitalism and the colonialism and all that sort of thing, which they did have trade and so on before. So how does one actually then maybe turn everything on its head for the second project and actually start with Africa being the model for the rest of the world?
Thank you, but I think perhaps we should hear from Abena on that. She's an African. She has studied all of this, and what I would like to hear what she has to say about that.
I am sorry, the sound is not great at all, so I am not able to follow, especially I hear you, Ursula, but I am not able to hear what the lady said, not unless you can repeat her comments.
I will gladly do that. The question was, or the suggestion was, that there should be...
I'm not hearing you now.
Oh, dear God. Shall I speak louder, or is there something wrong with my... Is the connection? Oh.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Oh, good, good. Well, the idea here, or the question was about whether it would not be a good idea to have a more sort of bioregional integration, you know, where people are already bound together by, say, nature, language, and that is going cross borders. Would that not be a sort of starting point as a category of one of the categories, at least, that you have had in mind when you did the project?
Okay, to begin with, there is a lot of movement within countries, and there's a lot of movement across countries. And economists would look at it as informal movements, informal trade, that to some extent we are not able to capture adequately. But our concern in this project was moving beyond the micro level, if you could say, to work on the building blocks that already exist, taking into account the state. So that was the focus, and Andreas, correct me if I am wrong, because we do recognize that at the borders, there is a lot of movement and integration. So I give the example of my experience when I went to the Ghana-Togo border some years ago. There was a constant flow of people moving across the border, but I was stopped. And I remember asking the customs person, why are you stopping me and you're not stopping them? And he said, we know them because they conduct business every day, moving from Ghana or Aflao at that time to Lome to do their business in the morning and come back. So there is that sort of integration, you could say, that already exists on an informal level. But what we want to have within the African context is to have greater integration, you could say, at the national level, because we know the benefits, economic, political, that can come about by having strong nations or strong states that are integrated. So I'm not sure if that addresses, the thinking of the person who asked the question.
At least I am in agreement.
That's the main thing. I'm also in agreement. Simon, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? I'm a former sociologist from Stellenbosch. I am able to speak French. I have had the privilege of having 3 doctoral students in Cameroon, and one of them wrote his thesis on a small market town on the border in Cameroon of both Gabon as well as Equatorial Guinea. So my first question is, in your book, do you have, because I think we've largely been talking, except for the last question, with a top-down approach, like happened in Europe through the African Union. Are the examples top-down, or are there examples, let me call them from a bottom-up, which is not simply local, but it is frontier? Because this student, he showed that in that region, that is the Central African Economic and Marketing Community, CEMAC, they have agreed that there's no need for any visas. They have agreed that there is, in other words, free movement across borders within CEMAC. Secondly, they have agreed on the common currency, which is actually very important. So all of the 6 countries in the area have a common currency. And then thirdly, they actually have in that region, not the whole region, they have a common language, which is fore. The fore is spoken in southern Cameroon, in northern Gabon, and in a lot of Equatorial Guinea. And as a result of this, you have had a very successful market town, which includes some form of tariffs, it includes some form of smuggling, but at the same time it is in its region, as far as he could decide, it is a success. And this is both socioeconomic, I suppose, the question is. So my question is, how important in terms of your looking at AFCFTA globally, or in terms of the continent, have regions been? SADC, Codestria, SADC, and so on. Because it would seem to me that there have been different successes as well as failures at the regional level. And then secondly, to link with what was said earlier, certainly there are regions where, both for bioreasons as well as local cultural reasons, but also for reasons of the states getting together, there is a greater, let's call it a greater potential for the development of AFCFTA values as in others. I mean, this is the kind of question I'd like, if possible, that you could speak to. And then finally, as a South African, is one of the aims of AFCFTA that people in our region should have free access to different countries, free flow over borders? Because certainly in South Africa, that is an issue. Thank you.
Well, I just, from my understanding, but I think the economist can answer better. comment more on what you just said. But I think that it's not, the idea here was not from top to down, to bottom. The idea was exactly the opposite, right? From bottom up.
Maybe.
So therefore, these categories, however defined, would be the starting point, rather than coming from the top and saying, right, this is how it's going to be for the whole continent. But as far as the economic...
Maybe Abena first. And,
Yeah.
Abena, could you hear what has been asked by Simon?
I think so. I think I could hear. And I think when the speaker was referring to bottom up, I think he was thinking of the very micro level, as opposed to the different regional groups moving up. So did we have papers, and were we thinking of the very micro level? I would say maybe not explicitly so. But having said that, as I mentioned before, there is, and given the example that you have given about the Cameroon area, there is a lot of, you could say, integration, and that is taking place at the micro level. And that's another reason you could argue why we need state structures to facilitate those movements rather than to create barriers. So this is another reason then why we need to have a successful integration. Yes, we have common currency in Central Africa, given the example I heard right that you gave, and we also have it in West Africa. And in terms of a certain amount of success within the ECOWAS region, we have the Free Movement Protocol, which is working. It has its problems, but West Africans can still move freely from one country to the other, and it's not necessarily, it is not within the context, you could say, of informal cross-border movements. Unfortunately, there was the last point that was raised to do with South Africa, which I missed. I couldn't hear that very well.
Let me step in. This book has no normative objective in the sense that we have an idea at the end, come to the conclusion, this must be done and this must be the final shape of African integration. It rather looks at different experiences, and you said categories, but also regions. We also looked at regions. And it was acknowledged by all African authors that Africa has this particular pattern of a spaghetti bowl, or how you call it, of regional integration areas, and that this is a particular topic in Africa. We Europeans, as I mentioned earlier, regard it rather as a problem, but our African colleagues rather saw the strength of it. And I'm now more or less convinced to follow that view. And I'm glad to have experienced that view. So there is no, and as I mentioned, the word AFCFTA, you find it 3 or 4 times in the book. There's no one has said, now I'm looking for an optimal AFCFTA. That's not the purpose of any author, and that's not the purpose of the editors. And therefore, your question about South Africa is a question which we didn't address. We would acknowledge and that any integration model needs to get support on the ground. And if there's no support on the ground for free movement of persons in certain countries, I would be the last to say, well, my textbook suggests we shouldn't do it. That's why I would say we did not address that, but we would be with you if the majority of South Africans says we need some sort of border controls. Yes, we need these border controls. And then we have very good experiences in Europe with this, with the Schengen Agreement and with the absence of borders. I find it particularly nice that I travel to Denmark and I don't know when I left Schleswig-Holstein. Only when I come to the next street sign, I see it's a different color. It must be Denmark. But I also see that others might see it differently. And this is left. And adding to this, I think that integration, free trade, is the most bottom-up you can have. Because you have no government that is telling me you must not make a contract with a person from Saudi Arabia. So I would call it an individual liberty, if not entitlement, to have free trade. But this is my personal opinion.
There is a question at the back.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Abena is the one.
Oh, hi.
Yes, I can hear.
Thanks very much. I guess my question would be around free trade in the interests and free movement, but bounded by the African continent, suggests a kind of limit to freedom. And it kind of starts at the Mediterranean and ends on the other side if people make it. So I'm wondering to what extent this individual liberty, the right to do trade, might also be expanded beyond African continental boundaries in the interests of wider fulfillment of human potentials, not an alignment of economic extraction.
Shall I start, or Abena, would you like to start?
If I'm understanding the question or observation right, we are now moving beyond African integration, is it not? And our concern within the continent is for us to begin with to have free movement of persons within the continent. I can say that we've got it for ECOWAS. And I would also like to say that my country, Ghana, I think last year announced that there's Africans arriving into Ghana don't need to have a visa. So on an individual level, you would find that some countries are putting into place policies to facilitate free movement within the continent. So once we think about, if I'm understanding you right, movement beyond the continent, then it's not only within the remit of African countries or of the African Union. We also need to think about the destination countries that people would be moving to. It was not an issue that we considered within the book. I hope I've been able to pick up correctly the intent of the question.
I think that was the intent of
I think it was answered, yeah.
It has been answered, yes.
I would like to make one minor comment here. If we think about movement of goods, services, and people, my understanding is that free movement of goods and services is a substitute for free movement of people. Because if people have a chance to find a job at home, they might not feel forced to move. If we assume that most people who move wouldn't move under perfect conditions, which I assume, therefore, freer trade is also an objective. So as a European, I would think the European Union should have offered the African Union a bicontinental free trade area long ago. Yeah. Maybe with limited freedoms as compared to the European Union, but still free trade, I would definitely be in favor of.
Ethan wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, and then Sishufa.
Thank you to the authors. Your presentation actually brings up so many questions, but I think that's what the intention must have been. I was actually thinking in the opposite direction from what the previous person asked, and that is why integration in Africa, except for the fact that it happens to share the same continent. So I was wondering, did you at any point in your writing up of this book think systematically about drivers for integration?
Yes, there is. In the theoretical part, we have also one chapter on just the simple theory of integration from an economics perspective. We then have chapters that are more dedicated to a sort of African thinking, Southern thinking, as compared, questioning, so to speak, the common wisdom we share as economists across the board, which is a good challenge, I think, for us. But we have a general theory of integration, general theories of integration in the book, and the argument is indeed welfare enhancement and more freedom. Your question implies that we should think about worldwide, multilateral opening, and we would always prefer that as economists, but it's not the reality.
Because if I can just add to this, what we now see is some forces in the opposite direction of globalization, of course, and regionalization. Now, in a sense, African integration is, in a global sense, is regionalism, not globalism.
Yes, yes. But this is a long tradition. I mean, we Europeans started that. I remember that Herbert Geers wrote a paper about the small or tiny European customs union back in 1960 something. So it's been always been that obviously people start to think about opening up to their neighbors rather than to anybody else first.
May I suggest that Sishua wanted to ask a question, and then there's the big ceremony of signing, and we sort of coming to the end. So,
it's difficult to ask questions when you're doing a book you haven't read.
Are you telling me?
And so my questions are very, very simple, and the result of my...
Sorry, I can't hear.
You must...
is it better now? Is it better now? So
yes.
I was making a confession when you said you couldn't hear that it's difficult to ask questions about a book you have not read. And some of the questions, I have two questions that may appear very simple as a result, so please feel free to provide difficult answers. The first is, for somebody who hasn't read a book like me, what would you say is the argument you are making in very clear, stated terms that departs from what we know about the many studies that exist on the question of integration in the continent? What do you see as your major contribution and departure from what we already know? The second one is, I know it's a new book and we very soon are going to start buying copies and signing it. But what would you say is the main weakness of your book? Thank you.
He's always difficult, so...
I take the strength and she takes the weakness. But Abena, you may start and I add anything I could.
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that we had different authors contributing the different chapters to the book. And so, how is this book different? I think one could say that this book is different because it is written essentially by African authors and trying to bring in a different, an African perspective. I will take an example of a particular chapter that I read. And in that chapter, the author provided evidence to conclude that contrary to what we think, Africans are trading quite a bit with one another. And I remember the first time that I read the chapter, I sent back comments and I said, no, this cannot be true. We all know that African trade is about 15 to 20% of the total. But this chapter makes us think again about what the determinants of intra-African trade are, and for us to not quickly accept the narrative that intra-African trade is very low. So that is something different, contrary to the usual narrative that we have low intra-African trade. Something else that the book brings, if I may say so, because I wrote the chapter, is the perspective on gender. You don't see very many books on African integration that incorporate a discussion on gender. And the African Continental Free Trade Area does have a protocol on women and youth. But I would say, why did we have to have a protocol like 4 or 5 years later? Why weren't issues of gender and equality incorporated in the agreement when it was originally put together? So those are 2 areas that I can flag that you could say are different. And what are the weaknesses? Well, we've been speaking quite a bit this evening on mobility, movement of persons, and that is what is missing from the book. We don't have the chapter that speaks explicitly to that particular issue. I hand over to Andreas.
I think that is quite well documenting the strengths and weaknesses. Another weakness is we have a policy conclusion and it's outdated when the book is in print. But this is, if you write a political economy book, it is always the problem that you are outdated before before the first reader takes it into her hand. And this time it's particularly dramatic, of course, because of the already mentioned development in the world. Otherwise, I would like to leave it to you to finally read it. And I think you're right, you haven't had the chance to read it, but what is a book launch when everybody has read the book? I think that's, thank you very much for the comments and questions. And they gave a lot of input for me to think about a new project. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the 3 of you, especially the 2. I hope that was not an indication that you need to apply for the next fellowship at STIAS, but we'll think about it. So, thank you. So we'll go to the ceremony of signing, and if any other individuals may want their book signed, as we have a glass of wine that can be done. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming and being part of this book launch. For the fellows that are in residence that I see, I'm not asking, but I'm asking for the book volume, what? Sorry? Yeah, and they said it takes 3 or 4
Doesn't
years,
work.
so no problem. So,
That didn't
thank you
work.
very much, Abena. It's been a pleasure to have you.
For the library. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Abena, thank you.
Whoops.
So the drinks will be served at the patio. And thank you, Sandy.